The lobby was marble and gold, humming with the polished hush of wealth. I had come to the building for something else entirely, an interview, a photograph, maybe a headline. But what happened that day had nothing to do with cameras. I remember the feel of the elevator button under my finger, the chill of it, the faint echo as the doors slid open. The man already inside didn't look at me. He was shorter than I expected, though the room seemed to bend around his presence. His hair was unmistakable, even beneath the soft lights, and his suit, midnight blue with a crimson tie, was tailored so precisely it looked like it had been cut from silence itself. It was Donald J. Trump, but this story isn't about the man the world knew. This is about the boy who got in with us just as the doors were closing. He was no older than 12. Sneakers too bright, backpack hanging from one strap, and a worn baseball in his hand. His shirt said, Camp Willow Pines, and he smelled faintly of peanut butter. He didn't look up when he stepped in. He just asked, 71st floor, please. Trump didn't respond. Neither did I. I just pressed the button, and then, somewhere between the 22nd and 23rd floor, the elevator jolted, the lights flickered once. Then again, and then we stopped. The silence wasn't immediate. There was a soft hum, then the artificial voice, we are currently experiencing a technical issue. Please remain calm. Trump muttered something under his breath, probably about lawsuits. He tapped the emergency button. No response. Then he pulled out a gold-plated phone, no signal. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. But I watched his jaw tighten, watched his fingers drum against the polished railing like they were used to controlling outcomes. The boy was the first to speak. Are we stuck? Yes, Trump said. Cool, the boy replied, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Trump blinked. Cool. Yeah, said the boy. I've never been stuck in an elevator before. It's like a secret fort. Trump looked at him as if he had spoken in Martian. It's not a fort. It's a hazard. There are systems for this. But no one can get in right now, the boy shrugged. So it's just us. That's kind of cool. I said nothing. I just watched, because something subtle was shifting. Trump loosened his tie slightly. Then he leaned against the mirrored wall. What's your name? Eli, the boy said. Yours? Trump hesitated. He hesitated, and then he said, Don. Not Donald. Not Mr. Trump. Just Don. Eli nodded like it was the most normal thing in the world. Nice to meet you, Don. They sat in silence for a while. The boy tossed the baseball lightly from one hand to the other. Trump stared at the ceiling like he could intimidate it into fixing itself. Then Eli asked the question that changed everything, do you ever get scared? Trump looked at him slowly, as if the question came from another world. His voice, when it finally came, was quieter than I'd ever heard it. Why would you ask that? Because grown-ups act like they don't, Eli said. But my dad says even the strongest people feel scared sometimes. They just don't like to say it out loud. Trump didn't answer, not right away. He looked at the boy. Then at his own hands. And for a moment, just one, I saw something crack beneath the polished shell. Not fear. But maybe something older. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then tried again. Yes, he said. Sometimes. The elevator remained frozen, but something else was starting to move, and it had nothing to do with electricity. The silence after that word, sometimes, was the heaviest thing in that elevator. Eli didn't ask what he was scared of. He just nodded like that was all he needed to hear. He leaned back against the wall and looked up at the light above us, flickering faintly like it was struggling to stay awake. I get scared before baseball games, he said. Like, even if I practiced a lot. My hands feel weird. And sometimes I forget how to breathe right. My coach says it's normal. Means you care. Trump didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the emergency panel like it had failed him on a personal level. Then, after a long breath, he said, it's strange. You can build towers, win arguments, own the room, but you can't argue with a stuck elevator." His tone wasn't bitter. Just, real. Eli smiled. "Maybe that's the point." That caught Trump's attention. "The point?" "Yeah," the boy shrugged. "Like when you're stuck, you gotta stop pretending and just be a person." That landed harder than he probably realized. Trump didn't speak for a full minute. When he finally did, his voice had dropped a layer deeper. "I used to think being strong meant winning. Being louder. Bigger. But there's a kind of strength that doesn't want to be seen." He looked down at his own shoes, polished to perfection. "I'm not sure I've ever been that kind of strong." I was still standing in the corner, quiet, absorbing every word. I was supposed to be a reporter, but I'd forgotten that job the moment the elevator froze. What was happening wasn't for headlines. It was for history no one would ever write. Eli stood and stretched, then pointed to Trump's watch. "What time is it?" Trump looked. 32 minutes since we stopped." "That's almost a whole class period," Eli grinned. "You know what I do in school right now? Math. And I stink at math." Trump chuckled, actually chuckled, and shook his head. "I didn't care much for math either. But I always liked buildings. Blueprints. What things could become." His voice faded for a second. "When I was your age, I drew towers on every piece of paper I could find." "Did you ever draw an elevator?" Eli asked, grinning. "Not one that breaks," Trump said, and for the first time, they both laughed, then the light stopped flickering. A low mechanical groan filled the space. The elevator began to hum and move again, inching upward. Floor numbers lit up. Trump stood straighter. Eli zipped up his backpack. But something had shifted between them, quiet, invisible, undeniable. When the doors finally opened on the 71st floor, the boy stepped out and turned back. "Thanks for talking, Don." Trump gave the smallest of nods. "You too, Eli." Then the doors closed. And for just a second before they sealed, I saw Trump exhale, not in frustration, but in relief. Like the kind that only comes when someone sees you without all the layers that he didn't speak again until the ground floor. The descent was smooth, silent, like nothing had ever gone wrong. But he wasn't the same man who stepped in. I could see it in his shoulders, in the way he didn't immediately check his phone or adjust his tie. He just stood there, watching his own reflection in the mirrored panel of the elevator like he was trying to recognize something buried long ago. When the doors opened, he didn't step out right away. I followed, and then paused. Behind me, Trump stayed still, his eyes lingering on the ceiling light that had flickered earlier, now glowing steady. "Strange," he said finally, almost to himself. "I've spoken to presidents, generals, billionaires, and yet that kid," he asked the hardest question. I turned, ready to say something, but he held up a hand, not dismissively, but gently. "Don't write about this," he said. "Not yet. Not while it's still real." And I agreed, because something about that moment deserved to breathe without interpretation, without opinion, without the noise. He walked out of the lobby slowly, without fanfare, the red tie fluttering slightly as he stepped into the street. The guards didn't follow. The cameras hadn't noticed. For once, Donald Trump had vanished in plain sight, and not a single flashbulb cared. I waited in the building for a while, half hoping the boy would reappear, ask for a rematch of truth. But he didn't. Life resumed. The noise returned, weeks passed. The elevator worked fine. But I found myself returning to that memory more often than I expected. Not because of who Trump was, the politician, the icon, the controversy, but because of who he became when a child didn't know or care who he was. Just Don. Just a man, uncertain in silence, humbled by a question not meant to harm, but to understand. Then one morning, I received a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo, the kind taken from a building rooftop looking out at the skyline. Scribbled on the back were 6 words: still learning. Still listening. Still here. It wasn't signed that IT didn't need to be, because for all the towers he'd ever built, for all the stages he'd ever stood on, it was in that elevator, stuck between floors, that Donald J. Trump found something he'd never quite built: stillness, and for a fleeting moment, perhaps even peace. Months passed. News cycles churned as they always do, louder scandals, newer faces, faster spins. Whatever had stirred in that elevator sank beneath the surface, undetected. Yet I kept watching. Not the headlines, but the quiet corners. There were changes, subtle ones, barely mentioned. A speech where Trump, uncharacteristically, paused mid-sentence, and said nothing. Just silence, for nearly 15 seconds. Cameras blinked, confused. Some mocked it as forgetfulness. But I recognized the stillness. I'd seen it before, in the space between Eli's question and Trump's answer. That moment had never left him. I learned that Trump had started asking for fewer people in the room before meetings. That he'd stopped interrupting the janitor who came into his office at night. A custodian posted online that Trump asked his name twice. Remembered it the second time. That might sound small, but for a man who had always spoken to rooms, not individuals, it was seismic. He never publicly acknowledged the elevator incident. There was no press release. No interview. But every Friday morning, a sleek black car would pull up to the same apartment complex in Queens. A doorman would receive a white envelope with nothing but a name written in blue ink: EliWaters.no return address. No seal. Just a note. Always one line I remembered to breathe. Or, I asked someone how they were, and waited for the answer. Or once, I think strength might be quiet. I never told anyone. Not officially. Because some truths aren't meant to be proven. They're meant to be preserved. Years later, when I finally tracked down Eli again, he was 17, taller, still carried that old baseball. I asked if he remembered the elevator. He smiled. He told me adults never forget being seen by a kid who doesn't know their reputation. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a box. Inside were over 30 notes, all signed with a single word: Don. Do you write back? I asked. No, Eli said. He doesn't need an answer. He just needed a place to speak. That day, I walked back through the city, past towers that gleamed with the same polish Trump once worshipped. And I realized, no building lasts forever. But sometimes, the right question, asked by someone who doesn't know you're supposed to be untouchable, carves its way deeper than any steel. And somewhere inside that man, that moment never left that he was still stuck between floors. And finally, learning how to stay there. It wasn't until after the man was gone that the letters stopped. They stopped all at once, with no warning, no goodbye, just silence. Eli noticed first. One Friday passed. Then another. He waited 3 weeks before opening the final envelope again, the last one he had received. It was the shortest of them all. Just 3 words: you were right. There was no context, no punctuation. Just a line that sat on the page like a whisper. By then, the world had already begun rewriting Donald Trump in permanent ink. Obituaries ran with headlines too polished to carry any real weight. Commentators debated which version of him deserved the last word. But Eli didn't tune in. He sat in his room, the letters spread out like puzzle pieces. Not of a presidency, not of a brand, but of a man who had once stood between 2 floors and finally let himself be seen. 3 months later, I got a call from a lawyer whose voice sounded like mahogany furniture and antique clocks. Mr. Ainsley, he said, you were listed as a second contact in a private posthumous directive. There's a sealed box waiting for you. I didn't expect much. A document, maybe. A book manuscript. But when I opened it in that quiet office, what I found wasn't paperwork. It was a small velvet pouch. Inside, a metal elevator button, original, brass, scuffed, with a tiny engraving on the back, 23 to 24. Beneath it, a single note: don't forget where it stopped. That's where it started. There was no signature. Just a faint scent of something familiar, aftershave, maybe, or time. I stood there for a long while, button in hand, trying to decide whether that space between floors had truly changed him, or whether it had simply revealed a version of himself he hadn't let speak before. But I didn't need to decide. That wasn't my place. My job had never been to define a man. Only to notice when he stopped moving. Eli later told me he kept the letters in a shoebox under his bed. He never read them aloud. Never posted them. But sometimes, when the room got too quiet, he'd pull one out, hold it for a while, and just sit with it, like a conversation that didn't need voices anymore. I asked him, years later, if he ever wrote back, even once. That he nodded. Yeah. Just once. What did you say? He smiled, the way someone smiles at the end of a long game played with no scoreboard. I said, "It's okay. I heard you." Years had passed since that elevator stopped between the 23rd and 24th floors of the tower. The building had been renovated twice since then. New security. New lights. Even the elevator panels had been replaced with touchscreens that hummed softly when you pressed them. The brass button Trump had once held onto was long gone from the walls, but not from memory. I still kept it, tucked inside a drawer of things I couldn't explain to anyone else. Next to it, a note I reread more times than I could count: "Don't forget where it stopped." That's where it started. In time, the world moved on from the man it had once orbitally obsessed over. His name faded from buildings. His brand dissolved under layers of lawsuits and successors. The spotlight turned its fickle eye elsewhere, and slowly, Donald Trump became what all loud names eventually become, a story that people retell differently depending on who's listening. But for two people, he wasn't a headline or a legacy. For Eli and for me, he was Don. Just a man who had gotten stuck, spoken honestly, and left something behind that didn't make the news. Eli had grown. He was 19 now, in college, studying psychology, of all things. Said he wanted to understand people the way he once understood a scared man pretending not to be. He rarely brought up the letters anymore, though I knew he still kept them. When I visited his apartment one spring evening, I found him sitting on the floor beside a box of them, older now, yellowing at the corners, but still neat, still intact. He looked up at me and said, "I've been reading the last one again. The one with 3 words." I asked that he nodded. "You were right." He paused. I still don't know what exactly he meant. I sat beside him. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is that he thought it. Eli smiled softly. He sent all these letters, and never once asked me for anything back. That was the point, I said. He just needed to talk. And you gave him that. Eli shook his head slowly. I didn't do anything. No, I said. You just didn't stop him. That's more than most people ever offer. The next day, I received an envelope with no return address. No handwriting. It had been typed, meticulously. Inside was a folded pamphlet, the kind you'd find at a memorial service. A photo of Trump in black and white, not a campaign shot, not from a podium. He was sitting in a chair near a lake, in a sweater, looking out over the water. The image was peaceful, unguarded, and if you didn't know better, you wouldn't have known it was him at all. There was no service date. No location. Just 3 lines printed beneath the photo. A man once believed noise would save him. Then he met silence. And finally, he listened. I had no idea who sent it. Maybe it was someone on his staff. Maybe someone in the family who'd known about the letters, the boy, the elevator. But whoever it was, they understood. They had chosen to close the chapter not with power, but with peace. Weeks later, Eli and I visited the tower again. Just once that we stood in front of the same elevator, though it was now unrecognizable. Sleek glass. LED displays. A mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling. But the memory was there, hovering in the hum of the cables. We stepped inside. Pressed the button for 23. Then 24.it passed the floor without hesitation. No pause. No flicker. Just motion, but as the numbers ticked upward, I caught Eli glancing at the ceiling light, as if half expecting it to blink. He said nothing. Neither did I. When we reached the 71st floor, the same floor he'd stepped off on years ago, we stood silently for a moment. No one else got in. No one else needed to. Do you think he ever told anyone else? Eli asked. About what? About being scared. I considered it. I think he didn't need to, after that day. Eli smiled, faintly, the kind you give a memory instead of a person. You know what's weird? That one conversation changed everything for him. But for me, he paused. It didn't change anything. It just confirmed what I hoped was true. What's that? That grown-ups aren't finished, he said. Even the loud ones. Especially the loud ones. I laughed, soft and quiet. You're right. We're never finished. We descended together, not in silence, but in stillness, a different kind of quiet, one that doesn't ache to be filled. When we stepped out onto the ground floor, I noticed something strange. Near the far end of the marble lobby, a new display had been installed. A glass case with a plaque that I approached it slowly. Inside was a single object. A brass elevator button, bold. Worn. Engraved .23-24 beneath it, etched into the plaque, were the words, "This is where it stopped. This is where it started." DJTI looked at Eli, and he smiled in a way that felt both ancient and young. Guess someone else remembered too. We didn't stay long. Didn't pose for pictures. Didn't post about it online. Some stories don't belong to the world. Just to the ones who lived them. Years later, long after the final letters had yellowed and the name, Trump, had become a word used more in history classes than in arguments, Eli gave a talk at his university. Not about politics. About empathy. He opened with a story about an elevator that once broke between floors. And how sometimes, the best conversations happen when no one's watching, and the only thing louder than power is the absence of it. That I sat in the audience that night, holding a button in my pocket, brass. Cold. Worn smooth at the edges. That it wasn't heavy anymore, just real, and that was enough.